Good afternoon, my name is Georgia, and as I previously discussed in my essay, today I will be analysing whether an individual's socioeconomic status can affect their likelihood to engage in criminal activity. So this concept has been tested by criminologists and sociologists for many decades, as there are very clear trends between education, welfare, social interaction and crime. I want to start today with defining what is socioeconomic status. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics defines socioeconomic status as the social standing or class of an individual or group. Typically, one's socioeconomic status is valued by considering their level of education, income, access to social services and occupation. Each of these factors aims to prove whether an individual is able to participate appropriately in society. And ultimately, this theory questions whether those without quality education, no access to social services and with a lower income are more likely to engage in criminal activity. So for today's agenda, we'll be discussing education, social services, the effect these socio-economic status has on Indigenous communities, and we'll also be looking at a counter-argument in white-collar crime. So the first factor that could determine socio-economic status is in education. When we look at current education statistics, we can see there is a strong connection between both the quality of education, the school participation rates and youth crime statistics, with 63% of prison inmates in Australia having an education level of Year 8 or below, and more than 50% of prisoners in Australia having reported that unemployment contributed to their incarceration. We can see that criminals are typically not highly educated people. Unfortunately, this is because those students, when they're engaged, are not fully participating in education, and they lack a proper routine, which means they have more time to engage in delinquent behaviour and ultimately lands them behind bars. Further, these students leave the school system lacking the skills to secure high-paying jobs and provide for their families, which means they resort to crime to supplement their income. These trends place high importance on education, especially as the Institute of Child Protection Studies found that school plays a protective role in the lives of Australian youth. So moving on to the role of social services. Social services are vital in all Australian communities, however they need to be made more accessible to everyone. By accessible, I do not just mean open to everyone, but they also need to be made affordable and geographically accessible, as rural communities are often lacking the appropriate support. As we know, most crime is bred from drugs, alcohol and violence, and so access to services like drug and alcohol rehabilitation, relationship counselling and mental health support are crucial in limiting crime. For example, an individual who struggles with substance abuse will need to access counselling and rehab services. Without the ability to properly rehabilitate themselves, this individual may turn to crime in order to fund their addiction. They may become aggressive due to the substances, or even end up in an accident due to their impaired state of mind. So with 2 in every 3 offenders testing positive for at least one drug at the time of arrest, accessible support services are necessary now more than ever. So what effect does this have on Indigenous communities? Well, unfortunately, Indigenous communities are often the most affected by low socioeconomic status, as over 41% of Indigenous Australians are living in low wealth areas, with the obvious gap between Indigenous Australians and white Australians in all areas such as healthcare, participation in education, out-of-home care, and not to mention geographical disadvantage, with many Indigenous communities actually residing in rural areas where it may take over an hour just to access the nearest doctor or support service. When we consider these social disadvantages, it is no surprise that the crime rates in these communities is extremely high, with Indigenous people making up 30% of the total Australian prison population, despite making up just over 3% of the total Australian population. Indigenous Australians are, unfortunately, the perfect example of low socioeconomic status, leading to increased crime rates. But in order to critically analyse this theory, we also need to look at some of the counterclaims. So one major criticism on this theory was by Edward Sutherland from 1940, who actually found that the connection between low socioeconomic status and crime is defeated by the existence of white-collar crime. He found that we cannot confidently say that all crime is driven by low socioeconomic status, low income or low education, when white-collar crime is almost exclusively acted upon by wealthy, highly educated individuals. He believes that highly intelligent individuals are actually often driven by greed to commit crimes such as fraud, money laundering, and insider trading, and this is not attributable to poverty at all. So, whilst I agree with Sutherland that white-collar crime is often driven by other factors, I do not accept that socioeconomic status is null and void in determining crime. In fact, it is clear that at least for the case of blue-collar crimes, education and income may explain the individual's circumstances at the time of the offending, and one's socioeconomic status can still be used to determine preventative and early intervention measures that we can place within our communities. Thank you.